Right, hello, greetings, it's Thomas Daffern here speaking. It's my weekly Sunday address. It's my custom, ever since far too long that Brexit, started picking up pace, and I decided this was a moral catastrophe as well as a political and ethical catastrophe. And I instituted a weekly fast day, which I'm still carrying on with until this thing is prevented, ameliorated, Scotland leaves, Ireland's united, whatever. Something has got to change. Brexit as such is, a moral catastrophe. I'm going to come on to that in a minute. I want to begin with a little summary of what I was up to yesterday and have been doing since we last spoke a week ago. Yesterday I had a very interesting online conference with some colleagues, about 20 of us, all over the world actually, in Europe, Britain, Canada, India, Turkey, Istanbul, sort of international gathering. And we were comparing the ideas of Sanatan Dharma, which is the eternal truth, which has arisen in Hindu philosophy. And it was articulated by Vivekananda, by the Upanishads, by many of the greatest philosophers of Hindu thought. And there are a number of, excellent talks on this. And then we were also comparing that with the Western idea of perennial philosophy, which is perhaps a lesser known concept, but it does exist. It was a term coined during the Hermetic Renaissance in the Catholic traditions of Europe, and it also was very influential. So some of us talked about the Western perennial philosophy, some of us talked about Indian Advaita Vedanta, and I'm just going to share a little bit about that. And then I want to go on and talk about what I've been discovering about the American Kompromat as an example of what happens when you don't have this eternal wisdom. Okay, so Sanatan Dharma means eternal wisdom, wisdom that is endless. Dharma, eternal law, cosmic law. So it's the concept that before the written law, there's a sort of eternal law within us all. And that was what the Druids, knew and came from. They existed before writing, and their laws were written in the heart. They were divulged at, they memorized examples. They knew intuitively what's the difference between wrong and right, between justice and injustice. That's why they were the lawyers to the kings of Ireland and Britain and here in Gaul. The Druids were those that could discern the Dharma. And the word Druid simply means a seer of Dharma. Dhru is Dharma, Veda is sea, so Dhru Veda is a knower of that cosmic eternal truth. And that's universal to all nations. It's, before Moses received the Ten Commandments as a written tablet, that knowledge was written on the hearts of all good people. And that is specifically, referred to in the biblical canon as the laws of Noah. Before that, they're the laws of Enoch. And John Selden, the great expert on Christian, Jewish, pagan philosophy in 17th century Britain, he specifically spoke about the laws of Noah, which is why he advised Cromwell to let the Jewish people back into Britain, because they're our long-lost brethren. We all follow the same ultimate laws of Noah. It's just some follow this scripture, that scripture, but there's one common ultimate truth. Now that's Selden worked at the Inns of Court. He was a legal expert, and this is an idea embedded in the philosophy of law. There's a jus, naturale. There's a natural law which ultimately comes from divine law. And it's written in the conscience and the common sense of all of us. We know it's wrong to kill, to steal, etc., etc. How do we know? Well, it's our conscience. And that is a spiritual gift to each one of us. Anyway, that's some of the meanings of Sanatan Dharma that we went into. In the West, the idea of the perennial philosophy is similar, and if I just quote from one of the texts regarding this, as I say, it first came into common use in the Hermetic Renaissance, which is a time I greatly respect, when the texts of Hermes, these ancient Egyptian texts that surfaced, found in a monastery in Macedonia, a country I love well, and were translated in Florence under Ficino into Latin, and suddenly scholars could read this stuff. Anyway, the librarian of the Vatican Library, an institution I've studied in, I love the Vatican Library, it's a treasure house of many great things. He had studied all the universal wisdom of Christianity and every branch, and he'd also studied the Hermetic wisdom, and he'd come to the view that there must be one common original ultimate source of all wisdom. He was called Agostino Steuco, Steuco, and his book was called De Perennial Philosophy, dedicated to his friend, who was Pope Paul III. And in it he said the following: there is one principle of all things, of which there's always been one same knowledge among all peoples. Well, that's what I'm saying, that what Steuco is saying, well, yes, if you think about it, that has to be the case. There can't be a sort of any tribe or any people, any humans on the planet that have not got this sense of conscience, of duty, of the importance of truth and the importance of love, and so on and so on. This is what it is to be human. This he also called the vera philosophia, the true philosophy. Unfortunately, it gets scattered. It gets watered down. People don't pass it on properly. But in the Hermetic tradition, it's quite powerful. He'd read the scriptures. He knew how they're a very concentrated form of this perennial philosophy. In his work, he mentions the role of Hermes Trismegistus 214 times. He mentions Orpheus 96 times, Zoroaster 16 times, and Jesus, of course, many times, and Moses and all the rest. For him, for Steuco, as for Ficino and Pico della Mirandola and these other great thinkers, including Cardinal Egidio, who was Luther's head of department. He was head of the order, of which Luther was a young monk. Unfortunately, Luther wasn't very learned. He didn't know this stuff, and when he went to Rome, he didn't study properly. And he was one of those sort of puffed up people that think they know something, and they get one or two ideas, and that's what they do, they bash on. Like the drummer in the orchestra who just bangs his drum, but he's tone deaf and he never hears what the other guys are playing. So, yes, and anyone who'd studied either the Hermetic mysteries or the Kabbalah had humility. They knew universal wisdom exists. Luther didn't, sadly. We paid a price for that. That's why it's so important to get our, even professors get it wrong sometimes. He was brave. I don't doubt his courage, and in his one or two ideas, he had some validity. But like the trouble is, it's distorted, and so the professors' one ideas then kind of rage like a fire and destroy lots of things. So let's just say that that's the Western idea, perennial philosophy. Now that idea lived on. It lived on in the Hermetic Renaissance. It lived on in Britain, in John Dee and the Shakespearean Renaissance that Dame Frances Yates wrote about from the Warburg. The Warburg Institute is a great haven of scholarship into this tradition, and I've spent many a happy hour in its library, which is right next door to where my office used to be at the University of London, when I set up my Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy. The idea setting that up was let's have an institute, higher education institute that's dedicated to peace through comparative global philosophy. In a sense, the perennial philosophical tradition unravelled, decoded in all traditions. It's there in Chinese thought, in Buddhist, in Indian, in Jain, in Sikh, in Jewish, in all the different types of Christian, and all the different pagan traditions, Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, Canaanite, all of them. And so anyway, that's the work I'm still doing. That's what was started right next door to the Warburg all those years ago. Well, 91, not that long ago. And so there were some great speakers, and you can watch. We're going to be uploading the video. It will be done soon. We had Professor Gavin Flood from the University of Oxford talking about Sanatan Dharma. He's an expert on Hinduism, and he gave a brilliant talk. We had Satyen Raja from Canada, who runs the Warrior Sage training body that does, and also has organised the Wisdom Keepers project, which I'm part of, to condense down sort of wisdom from each different sphere of the Earth's pressing needs. And then we heard from a Canadian amazing spiritual seer called Maitreyi, who gave a talk. She's a yogini, a brilliant, highly articulate visionary, really, a younger kind of sage figure. We heard from a brilliant lady academic sage in India, Srimati Neela Mishra, who's the chairperson of the Draupadi Foundation. She spoke about the role of women in the Sanatan Dharma, because women are half the story of life, and in India they're incredibly important for the home, the family, the transmission of values. And so she gave a brilliant talk. We heard from Dr. Gulab Kothari, a dear old friend of mine, who's the chair of the Rajasthan Patrika, which is one of the biggest newspapers in India, in Rajasthan. He has a television channel that he runs, and is a great media person, and has won many awards from the Indian and world community for his work as a journalist of integrity. It's rare in these days of Rupert Murdoch and co. and the Barclay brothers. He's someone that swears by the eternal wisdom of Dharma, and he's very learned in Indian philosophy and metaphysics, and he gave a brilliant talk as well. Then we heard from an old colleague of mine, Jai Hill, who's a British bard and druid and seer, who's currently living in Istanbul. I last saw him in Istanbul in Turkey. And he used to be the bard of Malvern. Some of you may have come across him there. And I met him in Malvern. He and I did events. He came and ran fire ceremonies in my cottage in Wales. And what's interesting about Jai, and he explained it in his talk, which you can watch, is that he was initiated into a Hindu order of firekeepers, going back to Babaji. Now Babaji is a very interesting sage. He appeared in, I think, 1974, if I'm right, out of the blue, a young man, and just appeared in a village in the Himalayas saying, "I've come to teach Sanatan Dharma." And he was specific, I haven't come to teach Hindu Dharma, I haven't come to teach any Dharma of any particular religion. I've come to teach the eternal Sanatan Dharma. And then he proceeded to initiate people, have an ashram. And some of the people he initiated were teachers of my friend Jai, who spoke about all this very movingly. He's also a bard and a poet, so he read a couple of brilliant poems, bless him. Then we heard from Sri Kavita Ashok, who's an environmentalist, a great sort of thinker through of the implications of Sanatan Dharma in the way that humans relate to animals, the environment, trees, nature, the crisis of environmental transformation that we've seen in poor old Texas with its Arctic winds, and it's not coped to, it's not equipped to cope, and we sent prayers to them. And this is all connected with the global warming thing. A lot of people think global warming means everything's going to become really hot. No, this is caused, as our next speaker explained, by the fact that the Arctic is warming up. So this blast of cold air came down, was funneled down into Texas, and he explained the science. This was K. Siddhartha, who runs Trans Brahma, a think tank in India, which we were collaborating on this together. He's a geoscientist and earth scientist, and he's published many books and been advisor to many governments and so on about ecology and environmental changes. So he spoke about Sanatan Dharma applied to environmental and ecological issues. And then I did sort of conclusion. And then we had discussions and questions. Anyway, it was a brilliant little 2-hour session, which will be, as I say, on our YouTube channel, I hope, in the next day or two. Thank you to all who participated. And, you know, there's so much more one could have said, and we were limited, really, because we're all, you know, at far ends of the globe discussing. But I just wanted to say in finishing this that if one says, no, I don't agree with this, I mean, the idea of the perennial philosophy was also promoted by Aldous Huxley. You may know he wrote a book about this. Aldous Huxley I have a lot of time for. He was descendant of Thomas Huxley, who was a great evolutionist and naturalist, a friend of Darwin. And they were inspired in the 19th century to think that, you know, nature, science can explain everything. Sir Julian Huxley, a zoologist, who was the first Director General of UNESCO, was also descendant of Thomas Huxley, and a bit more humble by the time we get to Julian, because he realised that actually science, knows a lot of stuff, but there's huge areas of knowledge it doesn't understand. He brought the right attitude to his job at UNESCO, I think, and in those early days they were doing pioneering stuff on the psychology of peace. They got Jung to do an in-depth study of the psychology of peace and so on, which I wrote up for my PhD as one of the many things. And then Aldous Huxley went even further, saying, look, there's whole areas we don't know about. There's consciousness. There's meaning and purpose. There's the soul, effectively, which science, as such, has left out of the picture. It's about, ever since Descartes, it's sort of said, well, there's soul, God, all that stuff. We'll leave that aside. We'll just do what is mathematical, observable, material, measurable. That's science. Well, Aldous said, like I say, no, actually science simply means knowledge in Latin or Italian, and therefore knowledge is encompassing all these spheres. We now need a knowledge of the inner psychic sphere, the noosphere. As Rupert Sheldrake, who's also saying the same thing, puts it, we need an enlightenment of the enlightenment. That's a great phrase, Rupert. And so Aldous was trying to do that. He was a pioneer in this. He was influenced by people that had experienced psychedelics. He experimented, he wrote about it. You know, he realised that these indigenous shamans in Mexico and elsewhere who knew about psilocybin and all that, they had been exploring their inner consciousness for literally millennia. And that we in the West, with our arrogant science, should not simply diss their discoveries. You know, the soul is what's of eternal value here. Anyway, all this sparked a kind of inner revolution of thought, which led to Abraham Maslow, the Esalen work, and the inner journey of the American psyche in the 60s. And he wrote The Perennial Philosophy, which is basically an anthology of quotations about this. You know, all the great thinkers of West and East have said this is the key thing. This is what we humans should be doing. Yes, it's great to have electric lights, digital cameras, etc. But if the soul is empty or threadbare or God forbid, evil or morally challenged, then there's no point in having all this tech. In fact, it's very dangerous. We have to also evolve our souls to a place of moral enlightenment or wisdom. And that's the point. That's what the Sanatan Dharma or Perennial Philosophy promotes. And so that's what we did yesterday. And it was a great honour to organise and focalise it with my other colleagues in India. So thank you all for participating, and I think it was a bit of a gem. I hope you'll listen in, and I expect we'll do something like that again. Okay, now I want to go the other side and say, well, what happens if you don't believe or practice in the Sanatan Dharma? What if you say, oh, well, that's all nonsense, hogwash, I don't believe in any of that, I just want money, power, status and sex. I mean, you have an empty life, but you might be outwardly very successful. I mean, Babaji had hardly anything, a little ashram, and a few devotees. I mean, people that pursue that inner path, we're not interested in the outer glory and the outer trinkets of the accoutrements, so to say. So there's a huge struggle going on the planet between those who are aware of the perennial philosophy and practicing it and have a piety in their souls, as Numa Pompilius tried to get the Romans to do. He was the second king of Rome who taught religion to the people of Rome, which is simply piety and an awareness of the perennial philosophy. Numa was a fan of the ancient mysteries, Orpheus and so on, and in the Roman context. And there was some discussion about what the word religion means, and I pointed out actually it wasn't a noun in the beginning, it was an adverb. To act religiously means simply to act impeccably and with your maximum excellence in whatever you do, be it giving a talk, going for a walk, building a house, teaching a university class, whatever. Do it religiously means you do it brilliantly. And that's what it means to be religious. It means to be impeccable in your enacting of actions coming from the eternal wisdom, the Dharma, the Sanatan Dharma. So, what happens if you don't? What happens if you fall away from that and enter a world of lying, cheating and stealing? Well, that's when you get the American Kompromat, which is this study I've been reading intensively, shockingly, by Craig Ungar. It's just come out, I recommend it, about what goes catastrophically wrong with society when people fail to live up to and adhere to the ethical standards. And what Craig has done is documented with many sources. He's interviewed loads of intelligence operatives and all kinds of people in America who've told him the backstory of how Trump got into power was on the backs of a sort of an underworld, criminal mafia in New York and in America, and globally, operating globally, which had no ethics at all. It was simply about naked power, wealth, and the pursuit of the unhappiness of others. As long as I'm all right, Jack, then I don't care. You can all go to the dogs. And yes, Trump is a product of that. The book reveals that he was masterminded and plagued by shadowy forces connected with the KGB behind the scenes. All that stuff about Russian influence, yes, it's true. It's documented in here. The case of Robert Hansen, the worst traitor ever in the FBI, was also a direct paid-up Russian intelligence agent, giving them huge amounts of data. He's now serving 9 consecutive lifetimes in imprisonment, and shocking the damage he caused. Interestingly, the other thing the book explains is that Hansen and his circle, and William Barr, who was the Attorney General to Trump, were often associated with a very right-wing fanatical body of Roman Catholics called Opus Dei, which goes back to the time of Franco and the fascist era in Spain. And the Opus Dei people are the sort of stormtroopers of the old guard of the Vatican who believe in, no salvation outside the church and using dissimulation, lies, deceit to infiltrate institutions and take them over from within. And the book actually documents how they've done this in America. I found it absolutely shocking that the Ministry of Justice, the Department of Justice, the Supreme Court and so on is riddled with people placed there by Opus Dei. This is absolute news to me. I'm assuming, he's done his research, he's got his sources right. The thing about Opus Dei is they're very old-fashioned, backward sort of Catholicism, which believe in self-mutilation, self-flagellation, pain is the path to happiness type of thing. You remember the albino monk in the name of the rose, the Da Vinci Code? Well, that's sort of Opus Dei type thing. And anyway, So there was a confluence of extreme right intellectuals in that fascist world, because it's fascist Catholic world, actually, and allied with extreme sort of rightist oligarchs behind what he calls Putin's mafia state. I mean, I know Russia, I love Russia, I love the Vatican, I've been to Rome, I find it very sad that there are people out there who are misusing positions of influence and power to do wrong in the world. But what he documents is shocking. And really, he points out, he proves, I think, that Trump was placed by these forces of darkness, who are some of the richest people on the planet, and who've amassed their fortunes for selfish purposes. Now, he then goes on to explain that one of Trump's closest buddies was Epstein, who was a very dark figure, extremely wealthy, owning huge properties all over the place, the biggest private house in New York, and was deeply into paedophilia and making kompromat. So he would invite you to a party, you can go and sleep with this 14-year-old upstairs. Meanwhile, the cameras are going to be watching it all, and then he'll get back in touch with you 6 months later and say, "Do you want to lend me a couple of million?" That's just shocking and mind-boggling, and it's everything that the Sanatan Dharma is not. It's abusive. And what's really scary is to think those kind of people were actually behind the Trump thing. Now, what's weird is that the QAnon thing said, no, but Trump's out to get them. Well, actually, no, he wasn't. He was their product. That whole QAnon thing, which was dreamed up by the very people that put him in power, was a fantasy, a complete, dissimulation, a complete lie, as I could always tell when I looked at it, because, and also I would point out that it's extreme hatred of liberalism. You see, I'm a liberal, politically and intellectually. I believe in a liberal theology, as I believe Biden does. There's another tradition in the Catholic Church which goes back to the Hermetic Catholicism of the Renaissance. It goes back to the Academy of Florence. It goes back to the founders of perennial philosophy and the handers of it on, because no religion, no branch of religion has an absolute monopoly of truth. There's truth in them all. And it's our duty as scholars, as that quote I read out earlier, to find that common truth, which, just to remind you, in Stucco's work, De Perennial Philosophy, he said, "There's one principle of all things, of which there's always been one, and the same knowledge among all peoples." Which is exactly what Leibniz and Newton said in their varying ways. They were trying to understand it mathematically. I'll come back to that a bit later. But what happens when you deny that, when you suppress it? Well, you get Epsteins, you get Trumps, and you get moral meltdown. You get Netanyahu and his kind of tribalist triumphalism. He won't even share the land with the Palestinians who were there as the land keepers when the poor Jews had to flee from Europe and the Holocaust. And all the great Jewish intellectuals wanted to do a peace deal, like Buber and all the others, and share the land together. That's still the only way to go. It was the extremist Jews, that Netanyahu comes from, that stable, who invented terrorism to kind of terrorize the inhabitants. Well, that's totally, it's against this tradition of eternal truth or perennial philosophy. No, the Jew, the Palestinian, the Sufi, the Kabbalist need to sit down under their vine trees and discuss, common ultimate truths. How can we understand the Quran and the Bible and the Torah and the Talmud, all coming from one ultimate source? That's what perennial philosophy is trying to do, and that's what I've been doing in my commentaries on them all. Anyway, this is what happens when it all goes wrong, and one has to study this stuff as well, because that's why one is a doctor. One is trying to heal this kind of stuff. And you can't heal it unless you know its causes and its consequences. Well, Brexit comes from exactly the same thing. I mean, I really want to write a book called British Kompromat, because where Brexit has come from is exactly the same stable. Slightly different cast of characters, but a lot of them cross over. It's the wealthy elites who've been running Britain behind the scenes for this time period, the last 20, 30 years. And if you look at people like the Berkeley brothers running the Telegraph, well, these people are Opus Dei types who have the same ideology, which is extreme right-wing, to crush and use legalism to destroy all vestiges of opposition in the state. That's Opus Dei's tactic. And the fanatics who push Brexit through, they were taking their payroll from Opus Dei, plus other sources. Again, it's the same thing. It's the Russian intelligence. We know that they helped fund the whole thing and made it possible. People like Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson, they're utterly beholden to these types. Now, so British Kompromat, it's going to be coming out soon. And if you have any information you'd like to share with me on that, please get in touch. Because that is the source of our shocking tragedy, which is called Brexit. It was this whipping up of hatred against a liberal, social democratic, common sense, federation, alliance, union of nations, each keeping their separate dignity and beauty and yet agreeing to work together for common ends and above all for peace. That's what the powers that are the elites don't want, because they're mostly involved in the international arms trade. What American Kompromat reveals is how these people behind the Epsteins and co were all doing international arms deals in the black market worth billions. And Trump was part of that whole milieu, that circle. And that's what's been going on in London. The same types, the arms dealers, they jet from New York to London, and then fly about the world raking in arms. And then they like to use them, as they've been practicing in Yemen with their Saudi, who's been a great buyer of all their arms, and therefore they are very happy that Saudi has this war going against Shias. And really, they're trying to stir up a third world war in the Middle East of Shias and Sunnis going at it, because then they can sell arms to both sides. It's what happened with Iran, Iraq. And it's what's been going on in Syria. This is why they enjoy creating these things. And we've seen that with the WikiLeaks, releases. Which is why Assange should be given a knighthood and let out of jail, like tomorrow, because he was a whistleblower. So, that's what we're up against, folks. We're up against that international cartel of hugely powerful arms dealers who now also try and control social media and try and control the print media, the Telegraph, the Times. Murdoch's part of that whole circle. And in the book on British Kompromat, I think we can explain the silence of the royal family and the inability to stand up against Brexit by the Prince Andrew tapes that Epstein took. We've only seen a little snippet. There's a whole bunch more that they've threatened to release if Brexit doesn't go through. That's and to me, as a Commonwealth supporter, someone that loves Canada, Britain, the idea of the Commonwealth, and the European Union, and the metaphysics of Sanatan Dharma, I find that shocking. It's as if the demonic forces, and that's really what these people are, have infiltrated and taken over the citadel. Okay, so, counter moves are necessary. And that's why I'm working as an educator on a planetary level. That's why I work with the World Intellectual Forum, and that's why I'm helping to hopefully set up a universal peace tower in India, on the very southern tip of India, with colleagues, as a symbol of, the fight back against immorality, ignorance, corruption.